thank you each for being here. I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be a fantastic opportunity to start to introduce to a lot of Division 19 students what research opportunities exist within military psychology. So I want to just go ahead and start with just a quick introduction. If each of you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit of who you are and what you do and where you're working right now, that'd be great. So if you want to start, Dr. Strickland, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Bill Strickland. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer at the Human Resources Research Organization, usually called HUMRO, in Alexandria, Virginia. HUMRO is a nonprofit organization that's been around since 1951, doing contract research mostly for the federal government. And until 1969, all that research was exclusively for the United States Army. These days, the DoD funding in various agencies is about 37 or 38% of our total funding. Did you want background too? I'm sorry, Nathan.
Yeah, that'd be great. Just tell us a little bit how you got to where you are right now. That'd be fantastic.
I'm a retired Air Force officer. I was commissioned at the Air Force Academy, was sent immediately to Ohio State University to get a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology. Went back to the Air Force for 3.5 years, writing promotion tests, which actually has had a good payoff for me over my whole career. Was selected to go back for a PhD at Ohio State University, graduated from there with a PhD, and then bumped around various assignments as an Air Force behavioral scientist, always on the user side. I was never a bench scientist. I was the person on the user side, defining the research requirements and then accepting the research from the research organizations. Later in my career, I spent time doing other things, meaning I was a recruiter and I was a marketing research manager and so forth. I ended my career as the director of all human resources research in the Air Force. So that was a great job. 4 years with manpower, personnel, training, and logistics, Air Force wide. Retired as a colonel, and virtually immediately, came to the Human Resources Research Organization, where I was vice president for 11 years, and I've 10 or 11 years, and I've been president now for 8. So that's my career. I'm an IO psychologist. It's what I've always been, and I've had my hand in IO psychology for many years. Today, I am finishing a 3-year tour as an elected member at large on the American Psychological Association Board of Directors. I'm a past president of Division 19, back at the turn of the century, so to speak. I think that about covers it.
Which century?
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Estrada?
The 21st century, Paul.
So, Armando Estrada, I'm a senior research psychologist at the Army Research Institute, where I am in charge of a portfolio looking at cohesion, readiness, and effectiveness. I've been with ARI for, I guess, the better part of almost 4 years. Prior to that, I spent my time in academia as an IO psychologist at Washington State University, and then prior to that, I was with the National Defense University in DC, and then the Naval Postgraduate School, also stationed in DC. And so throughout my career, I've always been largely sort of academic and government back and forth, and working on a variety of areas, principally around issues involving barriers to the career progression of women and minorities, and then also on cohesion, resilience, readiness, and effectiveness of organizations and teams, and with a predominant emphasis on military organizations. In addition to that, I've done a lot of work both with OSD in the United States as well as with DoD in Sweden. Aside from that, I've also I'm currently the chair of the, or not the chair, but the editor of military psychology.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Dr. Bartone?
Yes, well, hi everyone. I'm Paul Bartone, and I'm currently a visiting professor and research scientist at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And let's see, I'm an Army research psychologist for just about 30 years now. 30 years ago, I completed my PhD and which is something I really didn't plan on. It just kind of happened. And as a matter of fact, I found I came across an advertisement, a job ad in the APA Monitor, which was placed by folks over at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And it was kind of a catchy ad. And the point of the ad was basically, would you like to do something with your degree that will make a difference in people's lives? And that was kind of appealing to me. I did have a couple of academic positions, job offers, but I decided to go with the Army. Yeah, that was 1985, and I spent time at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, looking at issues like stress, soldier stress, health and performance. We, along with a team of investigators, studied military personnel and families in the Grenada operations in Panama, which I don't know if people even remember those operations today, but the first Gulf War, most of you will at least have read about that. From there, I went on to, that was about a 5-year stint. Then I went on to Germany, where we had actually through the 90s, we had quite a few troops stationed in Germany. And it wasn't too long there, then the Bosnia operation came up. And so I did a lot of work studying troops, stress, health, adaptation through Bosnia, the Bosnia conflict. And what else? Came back to the U.S., spent some time teaching up at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and doing some research there, and landed a position at National Defense University, and that was, I guess, about 12 years ago, and that's where I still am today. I spent most of that 30 years in uniform, retired after 25 years, and basically have continued doing the same work in a civilian capacity as a contractor. So that's pretty much my career story. It's been a great run. I've enjoyed almost every minute of it, and I've got to interact with great colleagues like Bill Strickland, Armando Estrada. COVID-19 has been a big part of my professional life. I spent some time as the president. I guess that was back in 2005 or so. And one of the accomplishments there that I'm quite proud of, with a lot of help from others, including Bill Strickland, Armando Estrada, Hank Taylor, and quite a few others, we were able to actually work with Division 44, the gay and lesbian group, and work out some compromises where we actually were able to convince the American Psychological Association to withdraw its ban on advertising. Back in those days, any DoD organization could not advertise in APA publications. And I think, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 2006 when we finally won that battle. And since then, we've been able to advertise in APA publications, which is which is a very big thing, and it carries a lot of second and third order.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for the introduction. It's
effects.
kind of nice to hear a little
So,
bit of that career trajectory.
Why don't I stop there,
Especially for
Nate,
those of us
and
just kind of getting ready to start the career at this point.
turn it back to you.
One of the big distinctions that seems to be made a lot in academia is the difference between basic research and more applied research. And for those that aren't aware, basic is just kind of referring to this idea of that you're doing the research for information's sake, to just learn more about the system or the individual, versus this applied to kind of more directly apply those results to the real world. I wanted to see if y'all could talk a little bit about this distinction, if it exists within military psychology, and how the day-to-day might differ if you're doing a little bit more of this applied versus basic. So Dr. Strickland, if you could speak to that.
Well, there's certainly a fundamental distinction. I mean, the money is different. So most, as Armando will say, most basic research is performed in a university environment. We do relatively little basic research at HMRO. At the lab, we had a basic, when I was in the Air Force, we had a basic research program in addition to our advanced research, or whatever they're calling it now. But the whole focus of my career has been on research that will be applied by someone fairly soon. So the basic research side is as you described it. It's research almost for research's sake. The notion is that there would be leads, but a lot of dead ends on basic research. The National Academy of Sciences, for example, last spring published a report, a committee consensus report, at ARI's request, at the Army Research Institute's request, to lay out a basic research agenda in my area, that is industrial and organizational psychology, selection, essentially, a little bit of training, but mostly selection. And that was to look at the research agenda. I happen to be a member of that committee. The research agenda really was defining research projects that I would never work on, right? It was in the sense of basic perception, spatial orientation. The distinction I would make is I know I want to measure map reading ability, and I will develop a test to measure map reading ability. Basic research is, what is map reading ability, and how does that differ into three-dimensional, two-dimensional, whatever. So that's kind of the distinction from my point of view. Armando, was in the basic research program, weren't you?
Right, I am. Yeah. So we actually at ARI, evolved. Well, I'll say evolved, but renamed it, and it's actually called Foundational Science Research, in which we're looking at extending methods, theories, with the hope of having some application to some military problems, but that's not necessarily the criteria by which we look at things for funding or for development. It's really just saying, okay, well, to the report that Bill is talking about, is looking at how can we advance selection research generally, and what kind of developments in theory or methodology might we seed that might eventually translate into something of value way down the road. And so the purpose is just, let's see what happens to see if something does happen, versus can we use it, and what value does it have. And so those are two basic distinctions that they carry in. And to your other sort of question is, do those things actually exist in military psychology? I would say definitely, both in terms of I've not been as involved in basic research per se. Much of my stuff has been applied, but I do,
And how much of your research
through my involvement in the
is,
journal,
per a directive,
do see
and how much
basic
of it is
research
just
coming
kind of
in,
your own
and
initiative of
having
where you want to be directing
some
your own
relevance
research?
in military psychology.
And how would that be decided?
So that I guess that all depends. So You know, in some ways, I've been very fortunate in that much of the work that I've done, in many of the jobs that I've transitioned over the course of my career so far, have been driven by questions that I have expertise in or curiosity. And so, you know, I left an academic tenured job to pursue fundamental research in the area of cohesion. And that was stuff that I've been doing as an academic anyway. So, and previous to that, I'd been doing stuff related to sexual harassment and harassment, prejudice, and discrimination, and that sort of led to a stream of research looking at those kinds of things within the context of the military. So I think there's room for a wide range of things. So, you know, I've also seen from colleagues, you know, where they're actually, you know, applying their trade to a variety of things to which they didn't necessarily have a strategic direction towards, but just simply, you know, this is the portfolio of the day, and this is what the, you know, sponsor was interested in. You know, you had skills and expertise that could help move that along. So,
Dr. Strickland, just to get back to a point you brought up earlier, that the applied
you probably
research
get
really
many
has,
different answers depending upon the individual
this idea
that
you want to be able to
you
apply
ask
soon.
that same question.
Is there kind of a general rule of thumb for how quickly that needs to be applied? I mean, are they coming to you and saying, we need to have this application in 18 months? Or is it more open-ended? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I've heard research time as defined as close to geologic time. You know, it's not always true that anything is going to get done fast. So even if, for example, ARI has a research requirement that we happen to be lucky enough to win the contract to do, once the research is done, it's going back to ARI. And ARI then has to worry about implementing it, which is not an easy task. They have to change the Army to implement some things. So it's not fast. We do have other clients, not typically the military, where we develop, you know, if they need a promotion test, we're going to give it to them in 6 months, and then they're going to use it. I mean, that does happen on the civilian side. But our client is typically ARI or its equivalent in the other services, and then they have to worry about the implementation. So I would say I cannot think off the top of my head of a product that we completed that went instantly into operational use. Some things have happened very quickly, like changing the Army's enlisted promotion system. We developed some forms and some formulae to do that, and a process to do that. But again, ARI had to sell that within the Army. So it's not like we're done with it and now it gets used. Armando is probably in a better position to answer that question. My Air Force experience was hardly, we were actively thinking we were going to be developing things to put on the shelf because when the Air Force needed it, they needed it now, and they wouldn't have time for a year's worth of research. So we wanted to be able to say, okay, here's a product
about just kind of that timeline.
But I don't know ARI's current logic in that regard.
Yeah, and I think what he said is spot on. I don't think, in my experience with ARI, is very limited to the last 4 years. So I don't have that bandwidth to speak beyond that. But I think it's fairly accurate what he said, in the sense that much of what we do is sometimes has a long tail for implementation. And at least in my time, I haven't seen something that's operationally driven and, you know, directly implemented that way. And I think, you know, it's fair to say that research just doesn't operate that way. And so by its very nature, it's going to take time to implement.
So
I think
on my side.
Paul would probably have some good insight, because I think his experience with the operational side might actually speak to some of this. So I want to encourage
Fantastic. Yeah, Dr. Bartone, could you speak to
You
that a
could
little
reach
bit?
out to Paul because at Rare they have a somewhat different model than we do here at ARI.
Yeah, well, back to your first question, Nate. Applied versus basic research, and I would say on the well, as Bill Strickland pointed out, certainly the money is different, 6-1 versus 6-2, 6-3, and that drives a lot of the decisions about what research to take up. I know the most about Army research psychology, but the other services, the Air Force and the Navy, are not so different. We do both. We do basic and applied research, but it's probably more applied than basic, and the lines do blur also a bit, and it's also more applied research in certain areas. For example, I think in social and organizational, those of our group who are doing more social and organizational psychology are I think more focused on applied. We have a number of research psychologists in the Army, and the other services do as well, who are doing more basic research on issues like traumatic brain injury and neurological damage associated with that, and how to prevent damage from becoming worse. But even there, you find there's an applied focus as well. For example, those same groups are looking at for how to trying to develop more efficient and effective tools for rapid diagnosis of traumatic brain injury in field environments. I would say probably about 90% of the work that I've done has been applied, which is not to say that it translates quickly or directly into policy changes. I agree with what the others have said, that the pathway to change can be a long and a slow one. There are a lot of factors that go into decisions about policy. Budget, for example, what are the budgets for that are available? Existing programs, sometimes it's very difficult, even when we know there are ways from our research to do things more effectively, whether it's in the selection area or screening, placement. It can be difficult for the military services to let go of the old ways of doing things. So there are a lot of obstacles to seeing your work get implemented in policy changes, but slowly but surely it does happen, and that's one of the great rewards, I think, of doing research psychology in a military environment. We get to see our work applied, I think. Although it's slow,
Yeah,
often
absolutely.
it's more
That's
quickly
fantastic.
than in
I wonder
many other
if you could speak a little bit,
organizational
Dr. Bartone,
environments.
to the difference between the civilian and commissioned side.
Does that
I know you
answer
wrote
your question?
the 71 Foxtrot Advantage, that I think is a fantastic book. Anybody that's interested in that commissioned position within the Army should consider picking up and leafing through. But I wondered if you could just speak a little bit towards the differences between the civilian and commissioned approach to research.
Right. Well, I don't know a great deal about civilians doing research psychology in the military. We rub shoulders with those guys and gals a lot. We work together on projects. There's a lot of great civilian research psychologist working for the military. The distinctions that come to mind are, let's see, number one, I think when you're wearing the uniform, I think that does certainly give you entree into operational environments in a way that our civilian colleagues find it to be more difficult, I guess, in many cases. We can, if you're wearing a uniform, you can deploy more easily. We do have civilians that deploy with units, but it's the whole process is easier if you're wearing the uniform. I think also our civilian counterparts have to work a little bit harder to establish their credentials and their sort of bona fides when they're out there doing research in the operational setting. So that's a distinction. There are other distinctions. I think that you know, it may be the case that that civilians have more autonomy and more control over the issues that they decide to investigate. I'm not sure about that. I think really the real issue there goes to seniority. I found that when I was new to the Army and I was directly commissioned as a captain, I had less autonomy, less control over my research agenda than I did as I accumulated years in service and moved up in rank. And I think that dynamic probably holds on the civilian side as well.
Hello?
Those are some of the distinctions. There are others, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion. Maybe Bill and Armando could add to that.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind for just a second, you know, I was a uniformed military psychologist, and I worked with civilians the entire time I was uniformed. And the huge difference for me was that every 3 years I went and got another job, and they didn't. That is, they progressed within a location, so there was career progression, but they got very good at what they were doing. And the military officer, at least in the Air Force, some time ago, if he or she wanted to get promoted, he or she needed to be looking for jobs that were going to be career enhancing in some respect. So, as I said, I took time out to go run a recruiting squadron, which was, by the way, the best job I ever had, but that's neither here nor there. And then I spent a staff tour in a headquarters a couple times. I worked in the Pentagon. I worked at major commands. I did things. Every job I had was fun, but it happened every 3 years. And when I came full circle, when I was heading up the laboratory, there were people in the laboratory that were GS9s, which is an entry-level sort of position for a professional. They were GS9s when I was a lieutenant, and they were GS15s or senior executives when I was a colonel. And they spent a career in San Antonio, and I did not. So, I mean, there really is that fundamental difference. If you really want to pursue a research agenda in an area, you can't be bouncing around every 3 years. Because every job I had in the Air Force was totally different than whatever job I had before that. So that's where I am on it. And there's no right answer to which is better. That's what I'm saying.
That a little bit about
it's really what it is, knowing what you're getting into, one way or the other, before you make that decision.
Yeah, and so much of my time as a psychologist was not in uniform. Well, all of my time, I spent my time in uniform doing other things than psychology. But I think they've made the right points, meaning that I think in a uniform capacity, I think you must be willing to go where the job is to keep moving forward in terms of your career progression, whereas I guess in the civilian side, you have a lot more latitude in that regard. There's other circumstances that might, come to play, but certainly it's not necessarily the same level of expectation that, to keep advancing and to keep progressing, that you would be required to move. And there's trade-offs. I think, it's a difference between, are you really passionate or invested in a particular research area where it makes sense for you as an individual to be put and to devote yourself to pursuing a particular stream of research, or are you more interested in particular sort of the application of a variety of different challenges and opportunities that you're going to see in our setting, and so I think there's room for both, but clearly you need to be in one location for a significant amount of time to be able to have
Fantastic.
significant
So
depth
one of the things I've heard
in any one
talking
area.
to
I
people
think,
about their concerns about
which is
getting
which is
into
something that
a
both
commission
Paul
position is
and
this
Bill
idea of up or
alluded
out.
to,
So
and
if you're
I
not
think
getting
that's
promoted
right.
after a certain amount of time, you're going to be pushed out. How are these promotions determined? I mean, what is the criterion by which we decide if a researcher deserves to be promoted at this point? Dr. Strickland, could you talk to that a little bit?
Well, there are some fundamental distinctions here. In the Air Force, research psychologists, not to be confused with healthcare providers, are line officers in the Air Force, and they compete with the people who are flying airplanes and fixing airplanes and running the cop shop and everything else. So it is a matter of doing the job the best you can and doing the right job and being in this up or out thing is we're really talking about for lieutenant colonel and colonel. I think. I mean, that's what we're talking about. The percentage of people who are promoted to first lieutenant and captain is 99.9. You have to not have had a DWI or something. Major is up in the 85 to 90%. So we're talking about doing your job right to get promoted to major. It doesn't really matter where you are. It's the lieutenant colonel and colonel promotions that matter in the upper out system, I think. And I don't know what to say about that. I was lucky. That's why I know I can say I was lucky. I had the right jobs at the right time to be promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then I was a squadron commander when I was up for colonel, and that's a pretty good position to be in. That's like an Army battalion commander. So you do the job right. You get jobs that you like and enjoy doing, and you do them right. That's really what there is to it. As I said, every job I had was very different. Oh, please, Paul.
Could I add to that? Yeah. I agree with Bill. And in my 25 years on active duty with the Army, it was not up or out for anyone that served during that time. It's more a matter of that served with me or that I knew of during that period. Doing research psychology in the Army, at least, it was more a matter of timing. When does the promotion come? At least up until the lieutenant colonel level. Now that varies, and promotions get more or less more or less difficult, more or less easy, depending upon the zeitgeist of the time. During the decade of war, Iraq, Afghanistan, promotions were faster for all branches. Now they're slowing down a bit, but with rare exception, the only people that I knew, the only research psychologists who left the service before a 20-year mark were those who chose to do so. And there were a few of those. And actually, there were a couple, I should say, who got into trouble for one reason or another, and they were forced to leave. But that's a very unusual, rare occasion. If you want to stay in and make a career of it, I think you have that option. As long as two things: you do good work, focus on your research, do the best job with the research and with the projects that you have underway. And the other thing is, not to forget, you do have to pay some attention to the ticket punches. You have to attend the mandatory schools that are required along the way, and all the services have them. The Officer Advanced Course, the Command and General Staff College. You have to do those things if you want to get promoted, but it's not difficult.
Well,
you can do those things and also do a good job on your research, really.
I think some of
But
the
you need to strike a balance.
Who don't have any background in the military and are trying to decide if it makes sense for them to go through more of the commission route versus a lot of the other opportunities that exist, either within the government or private contracting. What advice would you have for somebody trying to make that determination as to whether or not the commission route's right for them?
Well, it depends on the individual. The commission route was right for me, as it turned out. As Dr. Strickland was saying, to some degree, you have to expect, if you go the commissioned route, that you are going to get moved around. You are going to have to accept different assignments. Now, I was fortunate. I was able to stay in one assignment for 5-6 years before moving on to the next one, which gave me plenty of time to pursue a research program before moving on. But I think it helps if you go the commission route to be the kind of person who appreciates variety, who is not who can accept different assignments and is not thrown by that. So yeah, I think that, but it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. One thing to say too is that you're not locked in. If you want to give it a try, you can do that. You can take a commission and do that for 3 years, and if you don't like it, you get out. And it's like a postdoc, and it's great experience. And I know plenty of people who have done it that way and left of their own accord. In fact, that's how it was offered.
A little bit longer than most people hope for, I'm sure.
Come into the Army. This is a nice postdoc
Dr.
for you. And it ended up being a 25-year postdoc.
Yeah, better pension too, I think.
Right.
It was way better paid than a postdoc.
Right.
Way better paid.
Yeah.
So if I could just add one quick one to that, I think if you're, and everything Paul said is exactly right. The notion of variety I found appealing because I could have a limited attention span, and the notion of different jobs all the time is appealing to me. But I think a fundamental aspect of choosing the commissioned route seriously is a desire to be in charge at some point. Because if you really want to progress, if your goal is to be a colonel, you're not going to be a bench scientist for 25 years, I don't think. You will need to seek out and accept and do well at positions where you're the person in charge. And as a civilian, those opportunities are there, but it may not be as expected.
Fantastic.
And one can certainly get to
so
the
Dr. Schott, I wanted
13,
to see if
14
you wouldn't mind
level
just talking a
without
little
being
bit about how you feel
that-
your experience with the
again, a
military leading
fundamental
up to
distinction.
now working as a civilian has kind of shaped your research. Do you think it's possible for those who have never served to do what you're doing with the same efficacy? And what benefits do you feel like serving may have provided you in that research focus?
So let's see. That's a loaded question there. Um, I think the first part is, did my prior military service help me in any way? The obvious answer would be yes. And I was a Marine infantry guy, so I was nowhere near what Bill and Paul did. But I take to heart that experience, and so even as I look at research questions, I look at it from that perspective and say, okay, this is all wonderful science, but at the end of the day, it has to be applicable to the guy or gal who's putting on a uniform, and how are we meeting his or her needs, right? And that's probably, somewhat unique to how I have evolved and developed over time. And so having that appreciation for having been in uniform certainly informs and provides a window to establishing my credentials in a uniform setting, and certainly that's valuable. But I think you can get some of that, not to the same extent from having been in it, but you can learn some of that along the way, I think. And part of that may be partnering with others who are doing military research through internships. Certainly, getting involved in Division 19 provides a wonderful venue to do that. That's really how I circle back to military, to sort of merging sort of my military background in my training in psychology. Because when I was going through my doctoral program, no faculty was interested in anything remotely military, and they didn't know how, what, or where to do any of that. So it was quite by accident that I happened to stumble into a Division 19 social hour, and I happened to sit next to Deirdre Knapp, who then kind of opened my world into, hey, there's actually people in psychology that are really interested in, excited about applying psychology to the military, and it just took off from there. So I think getting involved in Division 19 is certainly one way to help build those bridges, to get some of that knowledge that you might not otherwise get unless you served. And so I guess it depends on the individual. I don't necessarily think it's a requirement to serve to be able to bring value to the field.
Fantastic.
But I also see some value of having
so the next thing I want to kind of just touch
been
on is
involved
the
in the
difference
military earlier in
between
my
more of a
life,
governmental research position and a
to be an
private
effective
contracting,
researcher in that context.
position, or more just private research work. So Dr. Strickland, I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind just talking to a little bit about how your side differs from more of just the pure governmental route of research.
Oh, sure. Sure. We have 45 doctoral level psychologists working at Humro. Again, a fundamental difference is we almost never get to pick the topic. We do what someone pays us to do. Now, we do have a great relationship with ARI, and with many of our other clients, we do get to talk about things and explore in a verbal way the kinds of research that might be done. And we do try and focus their efforts, but they're paying the bill. And the contract research psychologist is going to have to do the job that the sponsor wants done, whether it's if my interest is in selection and I'm put on a training task, that's what I'm going to do. And if my interest is in space perception and I'm given a general cognitive ability test that I have to develop, that's what I'm going to do. I think we're pretty good at Humro at putting individual scientists, matching them up with work that they're personally interested in, because we tend not to bid on work that we don't have people interested in doing. I mean, but you don't always have that luxury. And again, it's a matter of setting up. I'm sure Armando has a research program that he's laid out that'll keep him busy and his contractors busy for 10 years. And he can't tell me what it is particularly, because then I'd have a leg up on what I'm going to do in 5 years. But you know, we are in a much more reactive mode, I think, than the government side is. And I've been on both sides, and there are real advantages to both sides. You know, we can turn down clients. The government often can't turn down the general's request or this board or that board's request of the kind of work they want to do. But that's where I am on this. I think the work is, again, from my point of view, and I managed a lot of scientists in the laboratory in the Air Force who were often very frustrated, and I don't think this is much of a problem today at ARI as it was in the 1990s in the Air Force. It was often the case that it was the contract scientists who were actually doing the work. The idea may have been the government's, but the government was more monitoring the work than doing it. And that was a problem that I had in managing a scientific workforce in the 90s, is very, very bright people who are coming up with these great ideas who then have to watch a contractor do it. But there's the other side of that. You know, as I said, we finish the work, we hand it back to the government, and then someone there gets to determine what to do next.
So
whether to implement, whether more work needs to be done. All of
so you alluded a little bit to the bid process.
Coin.
How does that differ from a
you can be
traditional
frustrated on
like
either
grant
side.
funding process? Is it an open call for
But
proposals?
you can be happy on that.
And how do you? I mean, is it a written proposal? Is it usually a presentation? What's going on in that process? Okay.
That's a huge, it depends. Yeah, there will be a request for proposal typically issued by the government, and with a hard deadline and a written response required. And
Yeah.
sometimes the outcome is determined by price, sometimes it's determined by quality. We like to think that quality is always the most important factor, but you know, it may not be. So that's the general process. Almost all of our work is done that way. Almost all of our government work is open competition, at least initially. There are contracts that allow, once you win one, that allow the government to restrict its awards to people who have that contract. So, for example, we have a contract with ARI. We're not the only company that does, but ARI can then limit the competition to those people who already hold the contract. We always have to compete for
Dr.
the
Stroud,
work,
could you speak to that a little
but
bit?
it's not an open competition to the world. It's among the 4
Dr.
or
Stroud, would
5
you mind speaking to that a
contractors
little bit,
have
just
the
to give us kind of
contract that hold
an
basic
indication of your experience about the difference between the government and private contracting?
You learn to write good proposals.
Yeah, so I'll speak more on the government side because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I think from our side, kind of to what Bill was saying, you know, the challenge, and he said it correctly and very well. On this side, you're responsible for managing a wide range of research, and I'm fortunate in the sense that I came to manage a program that I have expertise in, but that's not always the case. But nevertheless, I mean, at least for my own personal struggles, I was, you know, how much do I get to play in that work versus how much do I have to partner with, you know, contractors to help execute it and stuff. And that's not always an easy thing, you know, because as a scientist, you're trained to do stuff. And so in the government side of things, you get to do some of that. But as soon as you start, you know, getting more senior, then you gain other responsibilities, supervisory responsibilities, and management responsibilities, which move you away from the bench. And so, you know, I think it's a constant challenge to find, you know, the right balance to be able to retain some aspect of the work that you are intimately involved as you would be sort of in an academic setting, but not anywhere to the same degree. And then, you know, you have to make peace with the fact that there's going to be a bunch of other work that you won't have the bandwidth to be able to do, and really what you're doing is managing, and not that you're not participating, but the nature of the participation is going to be very different. You might not be leading the work as you would in an academic setting, but actually you will be directing the work, and someone else is going to be moving out and executing some of that. And at other times you might be able to execute some portion of it. It just depends. But that's a significant challenge. You know, sort of on a very practical basis. With regards to the competition side and how that process works, Bill described it correctly as well, or accurately, I should say, in that, you know, all work that we either hope to accomplish for a specific entity within the Army or a specific individual that's requesting goes through a bidding process, and it gets announced, and it either could be a whole open competition where, you know, it goes to an audience of potential, you know, bidders, or to a much more narrow select group of qualified people that, you know, have expertise and the required knowledge and skill sets that
Dr.
we
Patone,
need for
Dr.
that. So
Estrada kind
it
of
just
alluded
depends
to
on
just
the
traditional
nature of the
academic
specific work.
process,
But generally,
in research.
regardless of the specific, there's always some level of
Your
competition.
experience at West Point and NDU differ from, or please?
Yeah, I'll answer that question, but let me just add a couple of thoughts onto the previous discussion. Contract work versus government employees. There are caveats that are important here. There's lots of different types of contract work that psychologists get involved in for the military and for DoD. But I think it's fair to say most contract work is fairly short term, and as Dr. Strickland pointed out, the issues are defined for you pretty much. There's also a question of okay, on the other side of that, if you're a government if you're a government employee, whether that's a civilian or in uniform, you can count on pretty much having some core funding that you don't have to compete for year after year. And so that gives you automatically greater continuity in your research program. And then there's the issue of benefits. If you're a government employee, typically you're getting medical care benefits, your health benefits, you're getting you're accumulating some kind of a pension fund, and those kinds of benefits, which are not always available, at least to the same degree, for contractors. So those are some important differences, I think. Onto your question, the academic, I guess you asked how is an academic position within the military environment, for example, at one of the service academies, different from out in the civilian world? Yeah, that's an interesting question. First of all, it's an interesting point that as a research psychologist, you may well have the opportunity to go into a teaching job, a teaching assignment, whether that be at a service academy or at one of the senior staff colleges. And that's interesting, and it's a great deal of fun. I was fortunate at West Point. I was able to basically split my time between research and teaching. Not everyone is able to do that. So I had something of a reduced teaching load right from the beginning, so I could focus not quite half of my time on research. I guess that's true in the academic world, but in the academic world, in the civilian academic world, how much time you have to teach versus how much time you have to devote to research is largely dependent upon what external funding you're able to get. I think that yeah, there are other differences. I think certainly at West Point, if you're teaching in the core curriculum, your lesson plans, the course structure is more well defined, I think, than you're going to find. You have less freedom to make changes to the course content than you would in the out in the big academic at a civilian academic institution. So that's an important difference, but still, I think there was plenty of opportunity to influence lessons and course content within the military academic environment, especially when it comes to electives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
I was able
So
to
I realize
develop
we are
a
bumping
number
up
of courses
just about at the end of time here, and
add
Dr.
them
Strada, I
into
know you need to run.
the
Just want to give you
electives
just
curriculum.
a last quick minute.
And the same is true at the staff
say anything
college
you feel like
level.
we didn't touch on that you
So,
touched on. Also, where we can go to get more
those are
information
some of the
about kind of your
differences.
directed career path. So, Dr. Strada, if you want to go really quickly before you need to run, that would be great.
Yeah, I think one thing that I think you'll find is a common core through anybody who's involved in this field, whether they're a uniformed civilian or academic or non-academic, is a genuine desire to apply and serve and use the research skills that we bring and that we learned to solve something of interest to the military or to military personnel and their family. And so, if you're interested in really applying, I think even the basic side, I would say, even though you may not eventually see the development and implementation of whatever basic problem, but the genesis of that really emerges out of some real need that the military may have. It provides a wonderful career opportunity. And you have, the variety that they both spoke to is so true. And just the opportunity to serve, I think, is unparalleled in any other place. As I stated earlier, I left an academic position. I was a tenured professor. I didn't have to, leave, but I left because a very interesting problem was presented to me that the military wanted help solving, and I think if as you developing as a young scientist, if you kind of hone in on what are those things that interest you, what are those topical areas that are of interest, and in addition to that is what kind of job opportunities. So is variety something that's important to you as a young professional, and in what forms? Those are key questions that I would say, as you're going through your program and, marching towards completion, to constantly explore and visit and ask, are there any of those things available in military psychology, be it as a uniformed research psychologist or as a government scientist or as a contract scientist? Because I think more often than not, the answer is going to be definitely yes. And it's just a matter of finding the right fit and shape to what you're looking for, to whatever type of position makes most sense. And, I've been really fortunate in that I've weaved in and out of different environments fairly fluidly. And I don't consider myself a unique person in that regard. I think that's a strength that the career field and its opportunities provides. That I think it's a wonderful thing to think about, and as a student, you have a lot of latitude to explore that, and you'll find that members of our community are very welcoming of students, and all you have to do
Fantastic.
is
Thank you. I think
reach
this
out and
And I can say
talk
anecdotally,
to
y'all have
any
all been
of our members, and I think
extraordinarily
you'll
welcoming,
find
especially at the APA, getting the chance to talk with each one
people
of you.
that are
So I
willing
can
to
corroborate that.
reach out and help,
Dr. Strickland,
because we've all
last
been there.
words where people can go to get more information.
So get involved is the bottom line of what I would say. So.
Oh, well, Armando nailed it, I think. One thing we didn't talk about is that, I really like the client. The client has real needs. And as Armando said, eventually this stuff gets out there and gets used. And we're often the envy of the research world when, for us at least, N of 500 is a small scale pilot study, and we often are dealing with databases with tens of thousands of people in them. More information, I think Division 19 is a good place to be. We're all here together, the research side, the clinical side. We are, in fact, a mini APA
Dr. Bartone?
in many respects. Just the resources that are available through Division 19, we're really easy to meet because we all hang around the same rooms at convention. So.
Yeah, last word, I guess. I just second what the others have said. The military is a huge population. There are, last time I checked, about 1.4 million men and women currently serving on active duty, with about 2 million family members, including spouses and children. And then there's almost another million out there in the reserves and National Guard, with another million plus family members. So it's a huge population. They have a lot of needs. The military as an organization has a lot of needs that psychologists can address. And whether you work as a contractor, as a civilian, government employee, or choose to put on the uniform, the work is interesting and relevant and important, and I would encourage anyone out
Fantastic.
there
Well, thank
watching
you
this
each for
webcast
volunteering your time. I
to
think this has been a tremendously helpful
join us.
webinar.
And
for myself
Division
and hopefully
19
for
also is a
everybody
great
else that will have the
way
opportunity to watch
to
it.
network
And thank you, Jeremy,
meet some
for
people and
running the
find
show
out
behind
more
the scenes.
and get your
And
questions
we'll leave
answered.
it at that.
So
Thank you all again.
I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. Take care.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for organizing it, Nate. Take care.
Bye-bye.